Hey everyone, I'm professional photographer Ian Plant, owner of Shuttermonkeys.com, and welcome to the Photo Critique. My goal is to help you become the best photographer that you can be. And that's why I've started these regular critique sessions to help everyone learn more about the art and craft of photography. If you'd like to submit your images, then just follow the link in the description below this video for a chance to be featured in the next Photo Critique. Hey guys, and welcome to the Photo Critique. Before we get started, I just want to give a special thanks to Hunt's Photo and Video, who helps make these critique sessions possible. Hunt's makes personal service part of every purchase, and their friendly, knowledgeable staff can assist you in selecting the perfect gear. Every episode, I will choose my favorite photo from the ones that were submitted, and Hunt's will give that photographer a $50 gift card. And of course, I want to give a huge shout out to those regular contributors, those brave souls who have been submitting their images for these critique sessions on a regular basis. We owe you a special thanks, and we've all had a chance to learn from your many, many mistakes. I'm just kidding. Your photos have been amazing. And we've had a lot of new contributors this round, so I want to welcome anyone who's new to the Photo Critique and thank you for joining in on the fun. And I'm truly sorry that I can't critique every photo that is submitted, but hopefully everyone will learn a lot from the photos that I do select. Also, this is a special episode to commemorate the release of my new Ultimate Photography Composition course. A few years back, I wrote an ebook called Visual Flow: Mastering the Art of Composition, and it was hailed by critics and customers alike as the best book ever written on the topic of photo composition. Well, now I have revised that ebook and I've combined it with almost 4 hours of video instruction to form the Ultimate Photography Composition course. So the best course on composition just got even better. So if you really want to learn how to master the art of photography, you have to check out this course. It will definitely help you become the best photographer that you can be. And also, for a limited time, I've got some coupon codes that will give you a really nice discount on the course. And you can find out more information about these coupon codes and where to order the course in the description below this video. And just a reminder, the purpose of my critiques are not so that you can hop in a time machine, go back in time, and fix your mistakes. I get comments from people all the time who say, hey, I really liked your advice, but if I had taken one step to the left to get a better composition, I would have fallen off a cliff, or some other reason why they couldn't do what I was suggesting. And that's completely fair. I realize these are armchair criticisms, and I don't know the circumstances that you have when you're making that shot. But the purpose is not to criticize what you've done and to say, hey, your shot isn't as good as you thought it was. The whole purpose of this is to give people lessons and tools and techniques they can use going forward when they're photographing similar subjects and scenes. So don't think of these as critiques on the photos you've already taken. Instead, think of these as teachable moments that will allow you to make better photographs going forward. All right, that's enough jibber jabber from me. Let's dive right into the photo critique. This first photo is by Linda Tommasulo, and it was taken in Letchworth State Park. And I think this is really nice. These are some reflections of summer foliage in the water. So she got down really low to get the reflections in the water. And there's sunlight on the trees in the background, but there's no light on the foreground, which is what allows her to capture that beautiful color reflected in the water. So this is a really nice reflection shot, Linda, very beautiful, but I do think there's one thing you could have done better. And I think you could have done a longer exposure. A longer exposure would have smoothed the water out a bit more. It looks like you took this photo at 1/25th of a second, which was enough to blur the water that was cascading over the rock, but there's still a lot of choppiness in the water all around it. All of that choppiness is creating this texture, these mini shapes, and there's a lot of this texture throughout the composition. And I think it breaks up some of that really nice color, and it also distracts the viewer from the most important shape, which is the triangle formed by the water flowing over those rapids. So the longer exposure would have blurred the water more, gotten rid of that texture. That would help the color stand out better, and it would focus the viewer's attention more on that most important triangle shape. This next photo was taken by Francisco in Northern Ireland in winter, and I really like this shot. There's a lot of good things going on. First of all, it's got great color. This is a beautiful sunset sky. Second of all, I like the fact that Francisco framed that sunset with those two trees, one on the left, one on the right. And I like the fact that one of the trees is closer than the one that's farther away, and that gives that tree a lot more visual mass, makes it bigger in the composition. And so that helps break up the symmetry, having those two trees at different sizes within the composition. And I like the lines coming in. You've got the fence line coming in from the left edge, and then you've got the road, which is reflecting the sunset sky, coming in from the lower right. And I really like the use of that diagonal line of the road coming in from the lower right to bring the viewer deeper into the composition. My only bit of advice, Francisco, would have been to get a little bit lower and closer on the road. That might have revealed more of that reflection. And that also would have made that diagonal line that was formed by the road more prominent in the composition. And that would help more effectively lead the viewer deeper into this scene. This next photo is taken by Jeff Hughes, and it is of the Morris Canal in Jersey City, New Jersey. So it looks like Jeff chose to make this photo during the twilight glow, so the sky is getting dark, but there's still some ambient light coming from where the sun was setting that's hitting all of the skyline and bathing it in this warm glow. So there's a really nice, warm, cool color contrast here, and I think that's very effective. But in terms of the composition, I feel that this is just a little bit too tight, especially on the left. So there's one really big prominent tower that's right at the left edge of the composition. And to me, this is the most important part of the skyline in the background. So I would have liked to have seen a wider view so that that tower wasn't jammed up against the left edge, because what happens here is the eye is just pulled out to that left edge as a result of that one tower that's standing up taller, attracting the viewer's attention. You've also got that bright red boat there. So you've got some of the most interesting parts of the composition pushed up against that left edge, and that just forces the viewer out of the composition. So a little bit more breathing room on the left-hand side, and maybe a little bit of breathing room on the top so that the top spire of that tower isn't cut off by the top edge of the image frame. I think that would help out a lot. So when you have an important shape in your composition, you want to make sure you give it some breathing room. You don't want to cut it off in the middle or something like that. You don't want to jam it up against the edge, because that's just going to confuse the viewer and potentially lead them out of the composition. Instead, you want to bring the viewer in the composition. So a little bit more breathing room on the left and the top for that tower will encourage the viewer to visit that place in the composition, but won't push the eye out. Also, I think you could have done something more interesting with the foreground here. There's this nice diagonal line created by that thing that's in the water, and I think giving it a little bit more breathing room, making it more prominent in the visual design, and using it more to lead the eye into the scene could have been very effective here. But overall, it's a nice photo. This next photo is by Hal Schnee, and it's of Avalanche Lake in Glacier National Park of Montana. I think it's a beautiful mountain scene. It looks like there's some fresh snow on the landscape, so that makes it look better, and there's some nice soft light on the mountain itself. And I like the way the lines of the mountains come in from the corners and the edges of the image frame, bringing the eye from the corners and the edges into the center of the composition. But I do think that this composition's a bit too tight, and in particular, Hal, I think you could have given it more space on the bottom to bring in more of that beautiful reflection. The water appears to be very calm, so the reflection is perfect. So I would have liked to see more of that reflection, more space. So you've got some really strong compositional lines that are formed by the reflection, and these are coming in from the lower left and right corners of the image, but they don't really have that much room, that much runway to lead the viewer into the scene. And whenever you have strong leading lines, you want to give them that extra space. You want to turn them into a runway for the viewer so that it's going to transport the viewer from the bottom of the image frame deeper into the center of the composition. So more space so that we could see more of that reflection would have been really great here. It might have been really interesting to experiment with a vertical orientation here instead of the landscape format. It would have given you some more room to play with those strong diagonal lines formed by the sunlit mountain and its reflection in the water below. To me, if you had gone vertical and gone a little bit wider and had those strong lines coming in from the upper right and from the lower right, converging in the center of the composition, this would have kind of looked like one of those ink blot tests. And I think it would have been a really cool composition. So you just needed a little bit more, a little bit wider, and a different orientation. and you could have really brought this up to the next level. This next shot is by Andy Godwyn, and it is of a marsh in the Napa Valley of California. And I think this is pretty cool. I like the fact that you've got the moon coming up between these two dead trees that are in the water, and you've got the reflection of the entire scene. And I think this image demonstrates that composition is a delicate dance, and you did a pretty good job here getting the different pieces to work together to form a coherent design. But I do think there are a few things you could have done differently that would make this more effective. So first of all, it would have been better if the moon weren't cut off at the edge of the horizon. So waiting for the moon to get up a little bit higher, I think would have been nicer. So instead of cutting off that very important shape, you would be able to see the full disk of the moon in all of its glory. And also, you can see that the reflection of the moon is blocked by the reflection of the branch of one of the trees in the water. And so I think that maybe if you had chosen a slightly different time and you had done a little clever repositioning, you could have avoided both of those visual mergers. So maybe waiting for the moon to be a little bit higher and moving around a little bit to the left or the right, so that you have the moon in between those branches and its reflection also between the two trees, not merging with something else that's sticking out like one of the branches of the trees. If you had been able to find that position that would have clearly revealed both the moon and the reflection of the moon, I think this photo would have been absolutely perfect. This next photo is by Josep Bernas, and it was taken in a Norwegian fjord, and he wonders how he could make this photo better. So first of all, I think this could have been shot in better light. This is shot during an overcast day, so the light's kind of gray, and there is some green color to the landscape, but I think a scene like this really cries out for bold, beautiful sunrise or sunset lighting. So getting out there when the light is better is, I think, a very important step when you're making landscape photos like this. Second of all, in terms of the composition, I like the fact that Joseph included some of the foreground here to break up the symmetry. But you got to watch out for those visual mergers. This is something I talk about a lot in my composition course. Anytime you have two objects that are coming together or merging or converging, that is going to attract the viewer's attention. And you can use that in a positive way, but it also can be something that distracts the viewer. And that's what's happening here, is that bits of that foreground shoreline, some of these flowers and plants that are sticking up, are visually merging with the reflection of the mountains. And as a result, wherever one of those flowers merges with the mountain, it creates this point of distraction. It attracts the viewer's eye in a way that isn't really helping the overall composition. So a little bit of clever repositioning would allow you to use the shape of the shoreline to frame the reflection of the mountains in the water. So it's a good idea to move around a little bit, experiment moving left, right, forward, and back, or even up and down with your camera to find that perfect position where the shape and the contour of the shoreline perfectly frames the reflection of the background scenery without sticking up into or otherwise merging with that reflection. And here are a few examples by Jim Geraltz that I think really bring this point home. He's got a pair of nice photos here, and there's some really great autumn color. And once again, I like the fact that he included foreground elements to break up that symmetry that you get with the reflection. And that makes the composition more interesting. But I think that these both would have been more effective, Jim, if you had paid more attention to the visual merger. So in this first photo, we've got some of these grasses that are sticking up. And if you had just gotten a few inches higher, you would have avoided that visual merger between those grasses that were sticking up and the background scenery that's reflected. And it's the same thing with the second photo. I really like that you included that fence post as a foreground, but I think you needed to have moved a little bit to the left and maybe gotten a little bit higher. That would have moved the fence post over more to the right. And if you got higher, it would also push it down a little bit. And that would put it in that V shape that's formed by the reflection. And that V shape would then frame the fence post sticking up into it. And so that would have allowed you to avoid any visual merger and made this very nice composition even better. This next photo is by Steve Rodvold, and he tells us this is his first time submitting to the photo critique, and this image is an abstract take on fall leaf reflections in the Minneapa River of Minnesota. So Steve, I'm just going to pause and give you a quick home state shout out, and thanks so much for joining us here at the Photo Critique. This is a great abstract photo. I love the use of complementary colors. You've got those rich golden colors of the leaf, and you've got that little bit of blue sky that's reflected in the water, and that blue and that gold, Those are opposite colors, and when you juxtapose these opposite colors, these complementary colors, each seems to be a bit brighter and more vivid, and it creates a really energetic color scheme. And it's something I talk about in my Ultimate Photography Composition course. And this is a really great photo. I don't really have any suggestions to make it better. I might be biased, Steve, because you're from Minnesota as well, but well done. And I think it's a good example of the creative use of reflections in photography. So great job. Next up is a shot by Buddy Scott from the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens in Washington, D.C. Buddy, that's where I used to live as well. So I'm giving you an old home state shout out. And I like this shot, Buddy. You went in and you focused on the water droplet on the leaf. So I think this is kind of cool. But one thing to keep in mind when you're photographing reflections is that the reflected surface and the reflected scene are in different focal planes. So when you're focusing on the water droplet on the leaf, the scene that's reflected in the water is actually very much out of focus. So another way to have approached this would have been not to focus on the leaf, not to focus on that water droplet on the leaf, but instead to set your focus optimized for the scene in the background that is being reflected in the water. So the result would have been that the trees reflected in the water would have been rendered in focus, and the leaf and the water droplet itself would have been out of focus. So that would have been an abstract look that I think could have taken this photo to a much more creative place. Next, we have a photo from Francis Gallogly of the Old Mine Park Bridge. I'm not sure where this is taken, but this is a great scene. So this is just a photograph of the reflection of this bridge. So when you photograph a reflection, the reflection is upside down. So it looks to me like Francis actually flipped this so that it looks right side up. And that's creating a little bit of a cognitive dissonance because you're looking at this reflected scene, but it looks like you're just looking at the actual scene. But you can tell that there are a few things off because there's some things in the water that are breaking up the image. And I think this creates a wonderful abstract quality. It's really misty and moody, and I really love this wonderful abstract quality that is created by this. So I think this is really nicely done. I don't have any suggestions to make it better. I think it's a really creative way of approaching this idea of reflection. So something that all of you can try in the future. You can put this in your creative toolkit. Just take a photograph of the reflection itself. Whether you flip it or not, I think you'll find that the abstract rendering that's created by photographing just the reflection can be a bit more interesting than photographing the reality itself, especially if you have things in the water that are breaking up the reflection, or if the water's moving a little bit and you get a much more abstract blurring of the actual scene. These are all things that will allow you to introduce a little bit of impressionism into your photographs. Next up is another reflection shot by Andy Godwyn, and this was taken in the Napa-Sonoma Marsh. And there's a sandpiper waiting in the foreground, and I think that was a great choice to include that sandpiper. That helps break up the symmetry. One thing I talk about a lot with reflection photos, and I'm going to talk a lot about today, and I talk a lot about this also in my Ultimate Photography Composition course, is that symmetry is a useful compositional technique, but often it's a good idea to find a way to break up that symmetry to make the overall visual design more exciting. If you've got too much symmetry, there might be a lot of balance in the photo, but it might not have enough visual energy to hold the viewer's interest. So by breaking up the symmetry, by introducing an anomalous element, you can make the visual design more exciting, bring some energy back into the composition, and get the viewer moving to that anomaly. And that's just going to make the symmetrical image look much more interesting to the viewer. So here, the sandpiper breaks up the symmetry in a really effective way. So there's some great color in the sky, and I love the fact that the symmetry is broken up by the sandpiper. I do think, however, that there are a few things that could have been done better. So first of all, the horizon's a little bit crooked. So straightening out that horizon is a simple step to making this a better shot. Second of all, the reflection of the tree actually stands out pretty good. It's surrounded by color in the water, but the tree that's actually sticking up above the horizon gets completely lost in that black background. So it visually merges with that dark background, forming one single amorphous blob of visual mass. And as a result, its shape gets completely lost in this composition. So when you're making reflection photographs, it can often be difficult to find a position where your main subject is sufficiently isolated from everything else so that it stands out, both in the actual scene and also in the reflection in the water. So a little bit of creative repositioning might have helped here. So I think getting lower might have helped pull that tree up so that it was above the horizon, so that it stood out from the background and didn't visually merge with that big black mass. But I think getting closer might have scared away the sandpiper. So another strategy would have been to cut out that top part of the composition altogether, to do a little bit of a crop here and focus the visual design only on the reflection in the water. So taking out that dark mass on the top because it doesn't contribute to the overall composition. Instead, it distracts the viewer, and focusing the attention entirely on that beautiful color, that really nicely isolated shape of the tree and the sandpiper in the reflection, I think takes this to the next level. Next, we've got a photo by Bill Crowley of Calf Creek Falls in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And I think this is a really nice photograph, and I like the use of the reflection. I like the shape of the foreground that helps lead the eye into the scene. And there's really nice use of complementary colors. You got the blue sky, and then the rest of the scene has got warm colors. So you got that warm, cool contrast, creating these color opposites. So on the one hand, you do have this warm, cool contrast, which is nice. But on the other hand, that patch of blue sky at the top of the image that's also reflected down at the bottom of the image is brighter than everything else. And so as a result, I feel that the viewer's eye is drawn out either to the top edge or the bottom edge of the composition. And it tends to pull the focus away from the composition and out of the picture frame. So I actually think there's a simple fix here, and that's just to crop out the sky at the top and crop out the reflection at the bottom. By taking those bright, distracting elements away from the image edges, I think it focuses the viewer's attention on the more interesting parts of the composition, the waterfall, and its reflection in the water. That also focuses the viewer's attention on these really strong diagonal lines that are formed by the sandstone alcove and other elements of the scene. All these lines are kind of converging from the right side of the picture frame over to the left, and that helps lead the viewer deeper into the composition. This image was taken by Mary Gomez Jackson, and it is of Moraine Lake. And first and foremost, I think this is a really beautiful photograph. The colors are amazing, and I love the texture in the background. And I really love that Mary focused her attention on the triangle shape that's reflected in the water. Working together, the scene and its reflection creates this bold diamond shape, which has become the basis of her compositional structure. And I like the fact that she included some foreground, some of the rocks that are beneath the water near her. I think this adds some more interest to the scene. And then the canoers on either side of the image frame, you've got the red canoe and the blue canoe. Those add an additional pop of color and more visual interest. They help break up what is otherwise a perfectly symmetrical image. So having that foreground, having those two canoes, that helps break up the symmetry, giving this more visual energy, making it more interesting for the viewer. But I do think there are a few things that you could have done differently, Mary. So first of all, I would encourage you to get a bit bolder with your use of the foreground. I think the foreground could have been used more strongly here. And second of all, the positioning of the canoes is just a little bit off. The red canoe on the left, I think, is perfectly positioned, but the blue canoe on the right is just too close to the edge of the image frame. And as a result, it doesn't have that requisite breathing room. It doesn't really stand out enough from the edge of the image frame. And it really is going to pull the viewer's eye out of the composition. So it's always tricky when you're working with moving subjects that you can't control. But if you had waited just a few seconds longer, it looks like that canoe was heading into the composition. You would have given it a little bit more space away from the edge of the image frame. And I think overall this would have been more effective. But still, this is an amazing, beautiful, and very colorful photograph. Nicely done. Now, I've talked a fair bit about how it's important to break up the symmetry that is often very common with reflection images. And here are two examples of photographs where the photographers used foreground to break up that symmetry, to create a visual relationship between the bottom and the top of the composition, and overall made the composition much more interesting for the viewer. This first shot is by Isabel Guerra Clark, and I think she did a really great job with this photograph. That foreground shoreline just works perfectly with the overall scene. So I love all the dynamic diagonal lines formed by the clouds that are in the sky and then reflected in the water. And I love the fact that Isabel chose the perfect position so that that shape of the foreground, that contour of the foreground, nests perfectly with the reflection of the mountains in the water. So there's no visual merger, and that shoreline shape perfectly traces the shape of the mountains reflected in the water. So it's a good idea to move around until you find a position where the shape of the shoreline will perfectly frame the scene that's reflected in the water and avoid any distracting visual merger. And Phil Green did the same thing in this photograph of Mighty Fitzroy in Patagonia. And it looks like Phil got some great light on Fitzroy that morning. And the reflection is just absolutely perfect. There's no wind, so you got that nice, calm water surface. So the reflection looks like a mirror. But what I think really helps bring this photo to the next level is the fact that Phil incorporated some of these rocks in the shoreline. And there might have been an opportunity for Phil to have moved a little bit to the left or the right and see if he couldn't frame the shape of the mountain better with the contour of the shoreline. But overall, I think that both of these photos are excellent examples of how you can use a foreground to break up the symmetry of your reflection photos and take them to the next level. So these are both beautiful shots, very well done. And finally, we come to our winner of this critique session. It is a photograph taken by Patrick Morgan, and it is an image of the skyline of Shanghai. And I think there's a lot of great things going on with this shot. The light is beautiful, the soft pastel light. It looks like Patrick did a long exposure. He used a 10-stop neutral density filter. So he ended up with an exposure time of almost 500 seconds. And so he must have had clouds that were moving towards him during the exposure. And when you are photographing clouds during a long exposure that are moving towards you or moving away, if you've got a wide angle lens, they're going to form this beautiful radial pattern. And that's what Patrick captured here. He's got the radial pattern in the sky, which is also perfectly reflected in the water. Also, the advantage of the long exposure is that it's going to smooth out the water. So if the water is moving at all, that long exposure is going to smooth it out and make the reflection look much nicer. So on so many levels, I think this is an absolutely fantastic photograph. I love the soft pastel colors and the compositional shape formed by the moving clouds. That radial pattern in the sky reflected in the water is absolutely perfect. There's some really great symmetry. I think this is a really good example of how symmetry can be used effectively in composition. But I think you all know what I'm going to say next. What this shot desperately needs is some foreground. And even a great shot can be made better. So the question is, what could have been used as an effective foreground for this photograph? So Patrick was actually very helpful. He showed us a picture of his setup, and you can see what's in the foreground, what he had to work with. And there's this barrier that separates the walkway from the water. And it doesn't really look all that interesting. So I can see, Patrick, why your instinct was to simply set up your camera on top of that barrier and exclude it from the composition and not have any foreground. But I think if we zoom in and take a closer look at that barrier, there are some intriguing possibilities. So the barrier is just a bunch of stone blocks that have been cemented together, and the joints where these blocks come together form these lines that push from the foreground to the background. So getting in close to the top part of that barrier where you have some of those lines, that could have been an interesting way to use those lines as leading lines, directing the viewer deeper into the scene. So if you had set up a position so that you had some of those blocks in the foreground, you were high enough so that the blocks weren't blocking the reflection, you could have those lines pointing from the foreground, leading to the reflection in the middle ground that then hands the viewer off to the background scene and the sky above. And if you had gotten in close with a wide angle lens, those parallel lines of the blocks would have been transformed by perspective distortion into diagonal lines that would be leaning in. This leaning in effect would create a vanishing point, which is a very effective tool for leading the viewer deeper into the composition because the human eye wants to follow those lines to the place where they converge or the implied place where they converge. So I think that these blocks might have been challenging, but I do think there was the potential to get really creative. So I think this is actually a really good creative lesson for everyone. So before you decide to exclude an object from your composition because you think it's kind of ugly or isn't really all that attractive or interesting, just kind of take a beat and think about it. Think about the shape that that object creates. So even something that isn't really all that interesting might create a shape that you can use effectively in your compositions. So Patrick, I think this is a wonderfully beautiful photo, and nothing I say here should diminish your accomplishment. But I think going forward, whenever anyone is photographing a scene like this or is in a similar situation, just think creatively about how you can use the shapes of the objects in the scene, and also think about ways to break up the symmetry of that reflection to make the visual design more interesting. And so, Patrick, even though this is a beautiful photo, even a great shot can be made better. So even though this is an A+ in my book, the next time you're out there, I want you to try and make an A++. Of course, we had many amazing photos that were submitted to the Shuttermonkeys photo sharing forum, the Monkey Lounge. Here are a few that caught my eye and deserve an honorable mention. I'm sorry that I can't critique every photo that is submitted, but please keep posting photos, either for critique or just to share. And if you haven't done so yet, please consider joining our growing community of passionate photographers, helping each other to advance their skills and talent. The best part is that it's completely free. Well, that's it for today, and thank you so much for submitting all of these amazing photos to this episode of the Photo Critique. And check out the description below this video to find out what the next episode's photo challenge is going to be. This is the theme that I want everyone to embrace, and I can't wait to see the photos you submit for the next episode. And if you haven't done so already, check out my Ultimate Photography Composition course. It will definitely help you make better photographs, and it will change the way you see the world. So stay tuned for our next amazing video adventure, and don't forget to subscribe to Shuttermonkeys here on YouTube. I'm Ian Plant, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Photo Critique. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Here are a few more great videos that I think you'll enjoy and learn a lot from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get notified by ringing that bell so that you always know when we drop our next helpful video.